So I started, and when COVID happened, I started getting into Carl Jung and my unconscious and analyzing my dreams, and then I realized that that there is what Carl Jung calls God is a transpersonal self. And that he's the one who kind of figured out we have a collective unconscious. He was able to give himself like a mushroom trip when he was conscious without taking mushrooms, right? And he would call it active imagination. So he could go into his unconscious and confront all these things that like archetypes and God that lives in your unconscious. And he had to have a person that was there to make sure he didn't go crazy. And so he did this for like 4 years, from like 1913 to 1917. And he wrote it down in a thing called the Red Book, which he would not allow to be published for 50 years after he died. Whoa. Because he knew if people read it, it would discredit his work in psychology. And so what he did during those 4 years, he then spent the rest of his life trying to explain to people what he had learned in those 4 years in ways that they could understand it. And so that's what the rest of his life was about. And they asked him, I remember they asked him, do you believe in God? He says, I don't believe in God, I know. And I was like, man, that's badass when you can say shit like that. And so anyway, I started to get into this. And so he figured out that we have a collective unconscious because he would see these symbols in his dreams. And he knew that they were like meaningful, but he didn't know what they meant. And then he started to study alchemy, which alchemy isn't what you think it is. Alchemy was about turning a psychological lead into psychological gold. And they were onto a lot of shit. And they had to keep it secret because of the church, I guess. And so they had to speak in code, kind of. And so he started to read alchemy, and he started to see these symbols that were in his dreams that they had written about, and they had already figured out what it meant. And he was like, well, how the fuck could I have a dream about something I didn't know I never read this book before. I don't know and that's how he started to figure that out. And so that shit has happened to me. I'll see symbols in my dreams. This happened. So I was, this is going to sound crazy. So I'm in the jungle, in a clearing, and this creature comes over to me. It looks like a big ape. His body's like a big gorilla, but his head is like half of a lion, half human. And I'm like, what the fuck? And he puts his hand out, and I'm like, oh, he's going to crush me. But I put my hand in his hand, and he took my hand gently, and he walked me into the jungle. And I was like, what the? So I tell this to I have an analyst Jungian analyst who helps me decipher what my dreams mean. And he said, that's an archetypal God, and that was them telling you it's time for you to go into the jungle of your unconscious, but you'll be safe if you long. And I was like, oh, so then like a month later, I'm reading this book, and there's that fucking thing, the ape with the lion. I'm like, I'm like, what? That's the thing I saw in my dream. Like, how did that show up in my dream before I ever saw it before or knew? So I'm having the exact same.
Is there a drawing of this in Jung's book, or is it just description in Jung's book?
It's called a Mithraic god. That's what I come to know. I was like, that's the fucking thing that was in my dream. So there's also another thing called the old man. So Carl Jung talks about this a lot. Like he would meet the old man in his dream, which was like a transpersonal self of God. Yeah, like
That's
that.
It? Wow.
So
how bizarre.
I had this big decision to make in my life. And it was, so what Carl Jung says is that your unconscious, your transpersonal self, will create a scenario for you where there's no way out. There's no matter which way you go, you lose. So I was in one of those. And I had a dream. And I'm standing in line at a Starbucks at an airport, and this guy taps me, and I see a shortcut. So whenever there's a shortcut, I'm gonna because it's a long line, and so I figured out I can go over here and I can sneak and get in and get my coffee first, and so I'm like doing that, and all of a sudden this taps, and it's the old man with the gray hair that Carl Jung had talked about. I didn't know it at the time. And I just thought this old man, he didn't say anything to me. It's like he just grabs my hand and he points to the end of the long line. And I go, fuck you, old man. Get away from me. What the fuck do you know? And,
whoa.
Well, now I eventually did take the long line in my not in the dream, but in my life. And as soon as I did, so Carl Jung has another saying. He says, the biggest problems in your life can never be solved. They can only be outgrown. And so I outgrew that. I was like, oh, so it happened. And so I've had these experiences of.
So, but you didn't finish that thought. Like, what was wrong with the back of the line? Like, what did you realize by going to the back of the line?
It's like I don't want it's a little personal. So like about the situation in my waking life, but I just knew that what I had to do then. Right. Once I realized that the old man that was my transpersonal self telling me, you got to do this, and so I had an awakening. I outgrew this problem. Because it was like my Jungian analyst refers to it as you're on a crucifix right now, and the only thing you can do is hold, maintain, don't make a decision, don't do one thing or the other, just hold, and then something will appear, and that's what appeared. It was in my dream. It coincided with the synchronicity and me reading a book about what I was supposed to do. I'm like, holy fuck!
What do you think dreams are?
So. I think it's a mistake to dismiss them. I think dreams are the same consciousness that creates this waking life, creates your dream life, right? And they're important. And if the more attention you pay to them, the more you'll get out of them, and the more it'll rise up to meet you. And so I keep a dream journal. I write down every dream I have, and you'll start to see patterns. And I've had. So I was reading this book called The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung, and it's amazing how it fits what's happening right now today, right? And I tried to get to Bobby Kennedy to read it with me, but he says in there, how during COVID, how comedians flipped, and all of a sudden you weren't allowed to question. I do that bit about that you quoted before, and you're not allowed to question and think for yourself. And
it used to be called reading.
Yeah, it used to be called reading. Don't do your own research. It's just reading. So now they're shaming me for reading, right? So Carl Jung talks about that you have a need. You have a psychological need to have an experience of the divine and a deity and all that stuff. And if you don't have that, you're going to create it. And so that's how those people, when I'm reading this book, I'm like, oh, that's what they did with COVID. They turned Fauci into a god. They turned science into a religion.
Right.
That you can't question it, right?
They're archetypes, right?
So that I'm like, what? So they just projected. So Carl Jung's all about projection, that we're projecting all the time, and that's how we get to know ourselves, right? So like when you fall in love with someone, that's his big one is that you have a feminine side inside of you, and it's called your anima if you're a guy, and if you're a female, you have a male, and that's called your animus. And when you fall in love with someone, like, oh, that thing, like, oh my God, I can't live without this person. This is the thing that I've been looking for. That's when you project that part of yourself, it's in your unconscious, onto that person. And so that's a real religious experience because you're rejoining, religion meaning to rejoin, you're joining your conscious self with your unconscious self. And that's why it feels like you're being stimulated from the inside, because you are. And you feel this oneness and this wholeness. And if I lose this person, I'll die.
Right.
And so that is what most people, that's why guys and it happens to guys in their 50s. And that's why a lot of guys leave their wife and they go for, it's fucking amazing how that happens, right? So that's all projection. And then eventually the projection falls off and then people get divorced, right? Yeah.
Interesting. So the religious experience is
the combining of your conscious self and your unconscious self, right?
In someone else.
And yeah, so you experience it by projecting it on someone else. And so, by the way, I meet my anima in my dreams all the time, and it's unbelievable. It's fucking unbelievable.
Yeah?
So they have different people's...
How often do you remember your dreams?
Every day.
Really?
Yeah. And so, like, to the point where if I'm going to have a session with my Jungian analysis, I'll take a nap, and I know I'll have a dream or two, and I'll wake up, and we talk about them. I'm a good dreamer, especially when you quit smoking pot.
So let me ask you this again. What do you think dreams are?
I think dreams are... spiritual, whatever is in your spirit, whatever is, it's God, for lack of a better term, trying to communicate with you and talk to you through symbols.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. That's what I think. I mean, I'm not an expert on this stuff. I've just been into it for like the last 4 years, and I just know my experience. And So
it is very strange how
and so if you
vivid
don't have
they are.
an experience of the divine, you are going to create it. And that's what people did during COVID with science and Fauci and all that shit. They it projected it onto that. And luckily enough, I've been having experiences of the divine through my dreams and my dream analysis. And then I also see it when you see synchronicities. Carl Jung talked about synchronicities, which are coincidences that have meaning. They're not just coincidences, right? So, and and once you start to look for them, you see, it's like when you buy a new car, you see that car everywhere. It's like once you start to look for synchronicities, they start to happen. So then it's like I'm constantly in communication with God. That's how I, for lack of a better word, that's how I feel about it, right? And so everything that happens in my dreams and in my waking life comes from the same consciousness. Carl Jung said that the future is set up by your unconscious long in advance, which is why it can be guessed at by clairvoyance. So anyway, so this book, the Red Book, that he wrote down his experiences of those 4 years where he could give himself like a mushroom trip, and it finally got published in 2010. And I'm not even able to read it. I just look at it, it's just like super confusing, and it looks like crazy talk. So what I do is I read books that he wrote up, after he had that experience, and I read books by other Jungian scholars explaining shit, because he's dense, man. He puts a lot of info in a little bit of, like, it took me a week I was reading a book called the Mysterium Conuncio that he wrote, and it took me like a week, just the opening paragraph, just to keep going. Oh, like, what the fuck?
Yeah, I tried reading his book on flying saucers.
Oh, really?
Yeah. What is Carl Jung's book on flying saucers called? But he had this concept about flying saucers. He thinks they're constructs of the mind, but not necessarily that they're not real.
The best book to start with Carl Jung is Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is his biography, and he wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And that he lets you in on a little, because he was more than a psychologist. He was a mystic,
Right?
And it's made all the difference in my life. I considered myself a Sam Harris atheist. I used to call myself, and that was mostly a reaction to me being brought up Catholic, and so I was rejecting religion, but at the same time I was also rejecting spirituality. And I didn't realize it, but now because of this experience, I realize, oh no, that it's just terminology. God is real. There is your ego doesn't control things. Your ego once you can make your ego subservient to the transpersonal self and your unconscious, that's the key to life. Realizing that you're just the way I describe it to people is that, we're all part of consciousness. Consciousness is an ocean, and then there's a huge wave. The part of the consciousness we see is the wave, right? And all I can do is surf that wave. I can't create that wave. I can't control it. All I can do is try to surf it as best I can. And by making yourself your ego subservient to, and keeping your eye on the transpersonal center, which is what Carl Jung talks about. That's kind of the key. It's unless you experience it, it's hard to understand. It's even hard for me to explain it. I've only done mild doses of mushrooms in my life, maybe 5 or 6 times. And the last time I did it, I remember when I would close my eyes, it would seem more real than when I opened my eyes. It was like, oh, everything seemed flat and uninteresting. And when I closed my eyes, I was like, this is the real thing. Mm-hmm. I'd like to stay here longer. So it's got to be what you said. That's why people are willing to sit in a cave and meditate every day, and because it's more real. It's a more like a rich experience.
I think we operate under the biological dimension. That's where our thing moves around, under the biological dimension, and all of our senses are tuned into the biological dimension because it involves injury and death and illness and crime and injustice and all these different things that can get you all ramped up in the biological dimension. But we're also connected to something else.
Jesus said, there's a quote, that the kingdom of my Father is laid upon the earth, but the eyes of men don't see it. So, so we're creating our own hell, right? And it's, I think, over-identification with the ego mind.